But what it really did well was, even though it talked about the tangential Windsors, it kept coming back to how it affected Elizabeth. And that's what I've been wondering for years now, is how does this affect Elizabeth? Well, hey y'all, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
You are exceptionally welcome to our tiny corner of the internet, here for the 4th episode of the 5th season of Netflix's mess, The Crown. We'll get into a little bit more in the next 2 episodes why it's such a mess, but if this is your first episode joining us here's a couple things to know. One is that we've got a Patreon. And if you're interested in hearing more of our opinions or thought processes or what have you about every given episode, you can join us on our pub tier. You can join us on our parlor tier to get early access, and you can join us on our porch tier to get actual one-on-one conversation with us in a non-recorded fashion. The pub tier this time, in particular, well, all the tiers, but definitely the pub tier, will get you a conversation about exactly what it means for a monarch to be divine and how that makes it different than the Pope and what doesn't it, because I have a degree in this kind of stuff, and so I can talk about theology a little bit. So we'll be chatting about that. What else you need to know? This season is under heavy criticism by the two still living prime ministers that are in this series, John Major and Tony Blair. Obviously, it's also always kind of been under criticism from the firm, but definitely more so than in the past from living political figures. And some of the elements of this episode kind of make you realize why. And I say that because two very factual things happened in this episode that are portrayed on screen. One, there was a fire at Windsor Castle. Two, the Queen made a speech on her Ruby Jubilee in which she called 1992, guys, the Annus Horribilis, the worst year of her life. One of those things was treated factually. There was a fire at Windsor Castle. Here is the damage that was done. It was started by a blown fuse. They rewrote the speech that she made. So this is the crux of the problem with how Peter Morgan has treated this entire series. It just keeps getting more apparent as we go on. A, as he plays faster and looser with things. And B, as people are alive that he's messing with their storylines. And by not having a disclaimer at the front by saying, that these are historically inspired fictions in a lot of ways. There's lots of living folks that are very concerned that people are getting terrible ideas about what actual history is, considering that a lot of schools don't teach modern history in Britain. Just like American schools, they stop at World War II. So there isn't
there's not a counter narrative anywhere. I mean, it's out there if you search for it.
Yeah.
But to presume that many people are critically engaging with the show that way, I don't think that's a safe presumption at all. And, almost every episode we talk about how irresponsible they're being by not making that explicitly clear, or by, changing things that don't need to be changed. Sometimes I understand to suit the narrative or the arc, they want to change things, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that, unless it's grossly misrepresenting actual people or possible character arcs. But on the flat of it, I don't have a problem necessarily with changing things dramaturgically or changing historical things to fit dramaturgical reasons, but like you've got to have a good reason and you've got to tell people you're doing it, and they are never telling people that they're doing it explicitly, and they don't usually have a good reason in our opinion.
So the reason they changed it, the speech in particular in this, is because they want to frame it as a way that Elizabeth like apologized to Margaret for ruining her life. It's not what happened. Like that's not the speech is absolutely
never going to happen. It's never going to happen.
Never going to happen. The original text of the speech is a lot about how she's grateful to the nation for making it like easy to serve them despite how terrible the year is. So again, the show wants us to posit that Elizabeth feels this real tug of war between family and duty, and it makes for compelling television, and she has to kind of do all this kind of thing. We don't actually have a whole lot of evidence that Elizabeth feels that tug. Maybe she did at the beginning, some of her early letters, but like by the time we hit the Ruby Jubilee, there's a lot of evidence that she's kind of settled in and was like, this is what this is. So how did she ruin Margaret's life? Well, friends, if you've been with us for a little while, our Mags was in love with a man named Peter Townsend. And who was not appropriate as deemed by Elizabeth for a whole host of reasons. So he was in the Queen's employ. He was sent to another location so that Margaret could not marry him. This comes up in particular in this episode for two reasons. One, we meet Peter Townsend again, played by a Timothy Dalton, who can get it still. And we find out that Peter Townsend is unwell. Also, all of the marriages of the Windsor children are dissolving all at the same time.
Except Edward. I think Edward was doing okay at this stage.
I think Edward, yeah, that's true. So, excuse me, 3 of the 4 marriages.
3 of the 4. Like, 75% is still horrible, statistically.
Still, and I am not somebody that believes divorce means that a marriage has failed. These 3 marriages should have never happened. So, I'm not entirely sure we can even use failure in that. Your social experiment did not work, is like how I would kind of term that. Every time I see Andrew on screen, every time he's complaining about something, I just keep thinking, right, but Fergie didn't have sex with underage girls, allegedly, so you can miss me with your indignation about XYZ.
So
I appreciate that they put him in, like,
nature
the ugliest bowl cut.
Yeah. That haircut is an abomination. And I understand that they're making, like, heavy-handed references, and they want to make him look like a buffoon and a child. But again, if you want to be historically accurate, like, or you could just give us, like, I don't know. I don't think they're going to get to Andrew's scandal on this show, which makes me sad because I think a lot of people who love this show might not know that he allegedly had many relationships with underage girls.
Provided allegedly by his friend Jeffrey Epstein.
I hate that we have to say allegedly, but we do. So, like, the fact that they showed him, I actually was a little bit gleeful about the fact that they showed him, like, being a pompous, immature idiot about the pictures of Fergie getting her toe sucked. And, like, can you imagine wanting someone to suck your toe?
I don't know. Could you, like, I could get really like, libelous here, and I won't.
Yeah. Like, but I enjoyed the Queen's facial expressions, but I was also incensed that was probably an accurate portrayal of that conversation.
100%. But one of the ones that's falling apart is Anne. And Anne, her first husband, and she, not great. We don't know anything about him. I have no idea if they just didn't match or, like, he was a cheater. I don't know.
I don't remember what happened with Mark, but yeah, she's divorced at this stage.
And shacking up with somebody in the Queen's employ.
Yes. Ironically, also the equerry, which I don't know what that means, but that's what Peter Townsend was. So it's like literally the exact same story.
So Margaret confronts her sister, like, Anne's allowed to be happy. I'm never allowed to be happy. I did all this for you. I took all the public flack so you could be perfect. You've never thanked me, blah, blah, blah. I bizarrely loved this episode. I have absolutely no idea if this is how Margaret and Elizabeth talk to each other. My guess is no, not even close. But here's some things we do know. We do know that Sweet Margaret never got her happily ever after. We do know that Peter Townsend died. We do know that Anne ended up with the equerry for a little while. I did love the touch at the very end where they told each other they loved each other for probably the first time in their lives. And then Margaret was like, well, that's middle class of us. Let's never do that again. And I think there's some real truth to the fact. Also, I appreciate that this episode really demonstrated to us that Philip, for all of his nonsense, loved Elizabeth. And
had her back.
And had her back and did not have her back in their marriage sometimes, but had her back in their job. As soon as he got over his nonsense about the coronation and some of his, like, whatever.
Stuff. Yeah. No, 100%. 100%. So I appreciated that scene. I was just thinking about it as you were talking at the beginning of the episode of our episode, of how, how unrealistic it was that the Queen would give that speech. And I think they could have, if they wanted to show that she felt bad or she wanted to apologize to her family, I think she could have written the original version of the speech that she wanted to, that they showed us that she gave. And I think you could have kept the conversation with the Queen Mum. Yep. She comes in. I loved her saying, like, the 3 questions we always ask ourselves. Does it need saying? Does it need saying by me? Does it need saying now? And I can't imagine that the Queen Elizabeth that we don't really know, but the Queen Elizabeth that we've seen, if faced with that, would not be like, she's right.
I'll give this speech instead. Yeah.
Especially one that's been on the throne for 40 years. So that's where I expected her to turn. But she didn't. She gave the speech, which was fiction. Like, if you wanted to have that, have her give the original speech to Margaret and say, I can never say this, but this is how I feel. And, like, deliver her the letter, as we spent the whole episode looking at delivered letters and reading letters and reminiscing. Like,
I know, I would have loved it if Margaret's, like, man of letters just kind of came up and said, the Queen sent this over, and there's just a note that says early draft of, and that's it. Like, that would have been in character.
And then she's watching her give the speech. She's got the letter on her lap, and she cries because she knows that her sister has to be this. And, it goes back to that conversation that they had where she was like, you did this to me. And she said, not as your sister, but as your sovereign or whatever. Like, It wasn't your sister that denied. I didn't deny it to you as your sister. I denied it as your queen. Like, it would have been, and we're not adding 18 extra minutes to a show in which they have a limited amount of time as a resource. Like, so there's different ways to do it than to outright rewrite what I learned from you and then from Google. That is one of the most famous speeches the Queen gave. So, like, pick an obvious one there, Peter.
Yeah, that's what got me too. Is like this speech is for anyone who. This speech is famous because it is the very first time that the Queen ever admitted she didn't like something.
Yeah,
it's the first time she ever said something was hard for her. It's the first time. And it is one of the reasons that then when Diana dies and she does not use this same language and does not come out, people are like, oh, you hated Diana. Like, you hated because you did this. So, like...
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, in a hilarious, to bring it back to what you said at the start of our conversation, the 2 big historical events that happen in this, the one that I thought was fiction was the fire at Windsor Castle.
Oh no, that's historically on the nose, but yes, that did happen.
I know.
Yeah.
But for me, it was too on the nose, and this show, especially this season, has been doing things way too on the nose. I felt like hammering us over the head. I'm like, I get it. I
know.
So I was like watching this episode being like, oh, for flip's sake, Peter Morgan, I get it. The royal house is on fire. Like, the metaphor. And when Margaret comes in and she goes, the great metaphor, and I was like, oh, stop beating me over the head with this. Like, her philosophical house is on fire, her real house is on fire. I get it. And then I did, like, the after episode research, and I was like, no, legit happened at the same time. And to me, that level of irony is like unparalleled.
Yeah.
Like, that is karma coming for the royal family. Not that they deserved it. I'm not like attacking the royal family, anti-monarchist, but like to have that much internal turmoil and then to have a blown fuse burn 100 rooms. I was like,
I know.
wow. You like that would, it's such a crazy story. It seems like fiction. And for that to be like the real part of the episode, I found fascinating, and as a historian, like delightful. Not that it happened, but delightful that, you know, it occurred or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I also thought this was a really solid episode of television and of this show.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I was worried at the beginning that it was going to be an all Margaret episode. Go back to seasons 1 and 2 to find out how Kristen and I feel about all Margaret episodes. If you're curious.
Again, I love Margaret as a character. I would do an entire series of the Margaret Files. But you told me we were watching The Crown. This episode, however, God, did they do that well?
It was such a good, like, what I wrote in my notes was like, it dealt with a lot of the consistent themes of the show in such a mature way. Mm-hmm. And like, that's what they are showing us, a version of this, of a lot of these people that are now in a mature stage of life. You know, the Queen's been on the throne for 40 years. Charles is in his 40s. Anne is in her 40s. Andrew and Edward are in their 30s. Like, they are in some ways still behaving very immaturely. But the show makes the argument a lot that has to do with like the nature of the royal family and its kind of isolationism and all of that kind of stuff. But, you know, I loved that even though Margaret and the Queen had that big blow up at the end of the episode, they were still sisters, and they're still the two people that know each other the best and the longest.
Yep.
And that felt really authentic. So yeah, I didn't hate revisiting Peter Townsend. I thought the acting in the scene between Timothy Dalton and Leslie Manville at the event that they went to for the ship or the tour or whatever, was adorable. They were so believable in like how hesitant they were and like, we have to not be obvious. And then they started dancing to their favorite song and they were just like, you know, young kids in love again, which parallels really interestingly to the conversation between Camilla and Charles in the next episode. But I thought it was acted like brilliantly, and like how that unlocked the Margaret that she always wanted to be.
Yep.
That like the break of her relationship with Peter Townsend was like the break in her.
Yep.
And we got to revisit a lot of Vanessa Kirby being freaking spectacular as Margaret in the first 2 seasons.
Yep.
But yeah, like reliving the whole course of their relationship through the letters and like the course of a day. It was really good television. It was really captivating and interesting. Paralleling that with the failed relationships of the next generation as well. As like, is this systemic? And like they talked about it earlier. Ironically, it was Andrew who had this part of insight, saying like he blamed the family for why these relationships don't work because they destroy anyone that's different.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about that statement, and then also that conversation where like Charles throws the temper tantrum about like if we were a normal family and Child Protective Services, like we would have been taken. At first they wouldn't have been taken. Like, let me just be really clear, because that is just, sometimes Charles is still an emotionally stunted teenager, which I thought is like a good example too, when Anne is like all defiant and kisses the, like, really, come on, like they are emotionally arrested in a lot of ways because of because Elizabeth did not, to our knowledge, have a whole lot of understanding of how to be a mother and a queen, and she really botched it with Charles. But God, Philip just made me wait till we get to the next episode, and I'm going to talk about Philip.
Oh my Lord, yes.
I would save it for the monarch moments, but you all deserve our feelings about Philip and how he behaves in that episode. When which I am 100% positive is factually correct how he behaved. Because man, is that on character. But like, they don't know how to human.
Yeah.
Like, no one taught them how to human. And that's really what, I mean, Fergie and Diana were human persons.
And that's why, and like the point that Andrew made, that like that's why they were attractive as potential partners for the children, was because they will make them look more human.
Yep.
Which I thought was it's a shame they gave those lines to Andrew, but those were really good points. And like Anne pushing back at a few scenes later where she says, "You cannot have all of me."
Yeah.
And I have bent myself into shape, but I will not give you all of me. Is an interesting position because, you know, is it maturity? Is it levels of fucks that like Lizzie is like, I can't do this again. I think she felt differently about it when she was younger, and when it was Margaret, even though Margaret points out like it's still the second daughter who has no chance to inherit the throne. Like, why do you care?
Yeah.
But you're letting Anne do it, and you didn't let me do it. So I loved those kinds of parallels, and the way that we're pulling this thread of what the 90s felt like for this family, and what they're they've spent so many years in this family and matured through these different ages and incarnations, and it was a very tumultuous time, and it's, as we said, always awkward that we know where it's ending. Anytime this age of Diana is on screen, I felt it less with Emma Corrin, because she was clearly like the 1980s Diana. Anytime we see like iconic 1990s Diana, it makes me slightly uncomfortable and sad, because it's like, in the Vulture recaps, they brought it out explicitly, in the like common phrase that we have in English, so that it's like watching a car crash, like waiting for the car to crash, literally and figuratively. We all know where that's going, and it tinges this whole season with tragedy and sadness and inevitability to what we're watching self-destruct.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, for the first 3 episodes of this series, of this season, you and I were both very concerned. But let me tell you, I was shocked at the end of episode 4, and I was even more shocked at the end of episode 5 that I actually found myself enjoying this TV show.
Yeah. All of my reservations still stand.
Yeah, obviously.
But like, this is the, you know, I didn't want them to mention Northern Ireland at all, so that they didn't, so that didn't
Great.
take me out of it like it did in episode whatever. Whatever that was that made me angry. It focused on the royal family, which is what I want it to do, and it talked, but what it really did well was, even though it talked about the tangential Windsors, it kept coming back to how it affected Elizabeth. And that's what I've been wondering for years now, is how does this affect Elizabeth? And we're going to talk a little bit more in that monarch moment about how she struggles with that speech and that scene with her mother, in which I would like to throat punch her mother. So we'll get into that a little bit in that one, into what, I mean, her job just seemed like it sucked. Like, I never understood why she didn't abdicate at a certain point. Like, after she got over obvious weird feelings with Charles. Like, lady, your job doesn't seem fun, my lady. Like, take a breath.
I think with her uncle, I don't think she would have ever contemplated abdication, even though she should have. I agree. But yeah, I mean, I think they've done such a much better job already in these 4 episodes than they ever did with Olivia Colman, bringing it back to the Queen.
Yep, 100%.
Olivia Colman so many times felt like a background piece. Even though Imelda Staunton as the Queen has not been the focus of some of these episodes, you're right. It has circled back to her as if she were like the sun of this solar system, which she is. So cautiously optimistic moving into episode 5.
Cautiously optimistic. I'll take it.
Cautiously optimistic. I never thought we'd be there after how
After the
upset we were.
detours that were 2 and 3. Yeah. Yeah.
After how upset we were about episode 3 in particular. But I'm sure the Al-Fayads will be back before the end of the season. Yeah, so I think we will put a pause in our episode 4 discussion for now. We'll be back next week for episode 5. If you are a patron, or if you would like to become a patron, you can hop on over to our Patreon for our Monarch Moment, where we'll be talking more about kind of the theological understandings of royalty as divinity, or in relationship to divinity, and kind of that element of the conversation where, unbelievably so, Lizzie was pushing back that she is in fact flesh and blood. I was like, girl, that's not what you've been telling us for 4.5 seasons, but okay, today's version of you believes that for the sake of this conversation. Got it. But we hope to see you on the Patreon for that conversation. It should be a good one from our resident theological expert. I will literally be teeing up that ball so that she can hit it out of the park. And if not, we'll see you when we see you next.
Bye, everybody.